for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Stewart. I'm President of Humanists Victoria. And I'd like to invite you to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land wherever you are this evening. I'm on Wurundjeri land and would like to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the first people of Australia who've never ceded sovereignty. They remain strong in their enduring connection to land, waters, and culture, and we have much to learn from them. And for those who are not familiar with humanism, I thought I'd also give you a brief outline of our position. Humanists Victoria works to build a more civilised society, fostering ethics based on human values. We consider that reason, free inquiry, and a scientific approach enable us to understand our universe and our place in it. We defend freedom and democracy and provide a positive alternative to religion and dogmatic creeds. We support separation of church and state and secular education. So tonight, Jack Verdins, who's known to some of you, is going to talk tonight about the public housing crisis and why we should all be concerned. He's been a member of Friends of Public Housing Victoria since 2016, and alarmed at what he has discovered going on, public housing policy reform has become his passion. Now, I imagine that I might not speak only for myself in saying that I think the terminology around housing at the moment is a bit of a minefield. And I'm hoping that Jack, in fact, I'm fairly sure that Jack will shine some light on this. Once upon a time, well, a couple of decades ago, I suppose, we used to talk about public housing, but now what comes through in the news a lot is a lot of talk about social and affordable housing. And it's a bit hard to know where the boundaries are and what is kind of how the ground has shifted. So that's my request, Jack, to be able to understand exactly what everyone else is talking about and to be able to interpret the news a little bit more intelligently. Some of the key tenets of humanism are inclusion, compassion, and human rights. And I think it's appropriate to go back to the human rights angle on this. There were 30 rights and freedoms outlined by the UN in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 25 says that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." Pardon the gender bias. But it includes housing, you will note. Victoria has a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, and that Act was passed in 2006. It basically covers civil and political rights. They did not manage to include social and economic rights at the time, so there isn't really any reference to things such as housing in it. Queensland has also recently, more recently, enacted a Human Rights Act, and I think it's basically in the same stratum. I want to remind you, please, that this year, well, at the moment, the Federal Charter of Human Rights is hopefully moving forward. And this year, Humanists Victoria gave a financial grant to the Human Rights Law Centre to help support that campaign. If you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to go to the website, the Human Rights Law Centre website, and consider adding your name to the campaign for the Charter. I think numbers really do count to persuade the government and to extend the narrative about these issues in the community. So I'll put that link in the chat a little later. But without further ado, Jack, I'd like you to address us. If you have questions that you would like Jack to address, can you put them in the chat, please? Howard's going to monitor that. Jack will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have a break in which we'll make a few announcements about what's coming up. And then after that, we'll have a wide-ranging Q&A session. So many thanks, Jack.
Okay, great. Thank you for the warm welcome. I became involved in this area back in 2015, 2016 after I moved to inner city Melbourne, retired, got on a committee of a local community centre just to try and do my civic duties. There was a public housing estate next door, and one of the members of the committee was a public housing resident. And in the spirit of looking after our local neighbourhood, we got involved with also looking, getting involved with the issues that mattered for the public housing tenants nearby. I just thought it would be something fairly simple, bit of marketing and messaging and whatnot. But frankly, what I've seen terrifies me. It seems something that's been hijacked intentionally or unintentionally. And I do admit a lot of this can be unintentional, but the bottom line is there's human misery that's getting missed. There's a lot of activity and there's human misery getting missed. And that's my one and only reason why I'm now so crazy about working on this issue. And it needs policy change at the government, and it'll be good, because what I will do is very soon take you through all those confusing terms, because that's a lot of it's because of that confusing terminology, which quite conveniently has been taken advantage of by people who can stand to gain, again, intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. The human misery of housing in general, right now, there's a thing called a public housing register or a housing register in Victoria. I had a look at it the other day, 64,000 applications on that register, which I estimate is about 116,000 human beings waiting for housing. There are also about 25,000 homeless people in Victoria. Not all of them sleeping rough. They may be in friends' places. Sadly, many in cars, and we've been hearing about that just recently down the Mornington Peninsula, as people will get onto that again, what causes that later. So we got 116,000 people on the register, 25,000 homeless, and many, if not most of those people will not be on the register. And also know for a fact there are many people who have abandoned being on the register. They've given up. And the reason they've given up is, again, this was on the Victorian Public Tenants website just the other day. The waiting time for people with priority access to public housing is well over a year. And just in the recent period, according to the Budgetary Committee of the Victorian Government, so they're looking at the spending coming up, they're estimating that waiting time has increased by about 3 months, which seems crazy, because there's also stuff in the news I'll talk about later called the big housing build, and the government's busy building more housing. So why is the waiting time going out? And may I suggest the waiting time is going out because the people at the front of a list are getting zero attention. It's very simple, zero attention. And it comes about because there's been no net new public housing built in Victoria for 20 years. So if you're at the front of that list, you wait until someone moves out or departs this world, and then the house becomes available to you. And of course, while you're waiting, there are emergency cases that will be put ahead of you, quite rightly. And so if there is this pool of people who are waiting forever to get into public housing, and they're sneaky, the government, they will find out that you're sleeping on a couch in a friend's house, and they will decrease your priority because at least you've got something. So I guess they've got to make a hard decision, but this is the sort of rubbish that's going on. So how did this all start? Well, back in the Thatcher era in England, they got rid of council houses. Someone decided it was a great idea to privatise them. And, and it's something they've regretted ever since. Now, no one else has come out and said it here, but that is exactly what's happened here as well, is that in fact, the government has decided to privatise stuff. So I'll just put up a slide here, which just shows you the state of public housing in Australia. And good on you, Bob Hawke. He was a man who considered social welfare a very important thing. From 1981 through to 1991, he increased the percentage of public housing for all households from 4.9 to 7.1%. So that's a massive increase when you're looking at something like the population of Australia, which also was growing rapidly also in that decade. And then we have Paul Keating, who comes along, who believed in open markets, free enterprises, floating the Australian dollar, letting the market organise itself. And what's happened? The percentage of public housing, the money disappeared. And in 5 years, he managed to crank it down to 5.2%. And just FYI for your information, right now, the Australian penetration of public housing is about 4.2% of all of the population. And sadly, in the state of Victoria, it's 2.9%, which is the worst state by far in the country. So just thought I'd share that with you. So anyway, now getting back to my promise, let's go through the terminology. Okay, let me be clear. If you hear the words social housing, affordable housing, community housing, it's not public housing. If it's public housing, people will say the words public housing. So anyone who is using those other words, and I'll explain what they are in a moment, is a member of a population who's heard the term social housing and assumed it's more of a friendlier term for public housing, because public housing has stigma. So they've invented a friendlier word called social housing. No. It's been invented to deceive the public, to hide from the public of what is going on. And the people who don't want you to know will continue to use the word social housing no matter how many times you beat them up and ask them how much of that is public housing, how much of that is community housing, or whatever you're talking about. So let me be clear, public housing is public housing. You pay 25% of your income as rent, even if it's zero, but of course you'll have some basic income. And the security of tenure is there. You get to stay in the property where you're allocated, and you can also apply for transfers. There's another thing called community housing. Now, community housing is run by private businesses. They're not welfare, they're businesses. They charge up to 30% of your income as rent. And it's interesting, the Community Housing Industry Association brochure says they may also negotiate a higher rental. Also, you sign a lease of community housing, and if your income drops, sadly, you're stuck with whatever you signed the lease on until the lease gets renegotiated. So it's not just 25% of your income as it goes dynamically. It's very much a different world. Also in community housing, the tenants report quite often that they get charged sundries, levies, cleaning fees, whatever. I can see people nodding. So this is another way where you start paying more than your 30%. And just to let you know also that the government also has a thing called Commonwealth Rent Assistance that they will provide or pay directly to the community housing provider, which is usually about $70 a week as well. And that's just purely, you know, from the rental tenant's point of view. Let's be clear though, these are businesses that they have plans based around profitability. Being not for profits, profitability would be more not making a loss. But I also love reading the annual reports of many community housing businesses, and they have this thing called retained earnings. Sounds like a profit to me. And of course, they use these retained earnings to go and buy more properties, because one of the business goals of a community housing organisation, and you see it often, is this thing called asset growth. Not the sort of stuff that exactly interests someone who's desperate for public housing. But this, let me tell you, is what people are talking about almost every time they talk about social housing. The social housing is purely, I call it a weasel word to hide behind about what is really going on. People are talking about community housing. Now, I love watching press conferences. I guess during COVID, we all watched a few conferences, didn't we? You know, but maybe that's where I got the habit. But then I watched also the conferences during the last election campaign, and we all heard the story of Anthony Albanese, the public housing, the boy from public housing. They all talked public housing, and I saw Anthony Albanese choke because he said, and that is why Labor has a policy for more social housing. And he's almost said the word public housing, and he realised they're not building any public housing. They have a policy for no public housing. And so he was talking about, I grew up eating oranges and we're now going to grow apples for everyone. Something totally different. So that's what community housing is. And social housing is actually, it was gazetted, or they changed the Housing Act in Victoria for it to mean the umbrella term for for public and community housing. So you add the two together and we call it social housing. It was very hard to understand then when someone makes an announcement about the big housing bill. We're going to build 12,000 social housing properties. And you go, how much of that is public housing? Now, Ellen Sandell from the Greens stood up in Parliament and actually went through what I've just done, probably in a much nicer way, about the misleading term social housing, and asked the question, how much of the big housing build is public housing and how much of it is community housing? In other words, privatised housing. Never got an answer. But we know, and I'll show you a table from the big housing build later, it's community housing. It is not public housing. And the government, in fact, had a input to its 10-year housing inquiry, and they said in there, part of the briefing paper to people wanting to do inputs, that there is no future for public housing in Victoria other than maintaining the properties. Okay, give you an idea of sizes. Depending on who's doing the counting, and it's a terrible area for counting numbers, it's about 64,000 properties in Victoria are public housing properties. Only about 10% of those are the visible ones that we all see in the towers. So there's a heck of a lot of units and houses, and I know people doing this and people living in their own standalone houses or in a unit in the middle of a complex, which are rented or bought or owned by Housing Victoria, and public housing tenants lived in there. So it's like the towers. Don't start imagining that public housing is just towers. It's not. In terms of the volume of community housing around the place, the community housing industry, I actually got this number from them, very different from how the government counts it. But anyway, I'll give the industry's number, and they said there was 11,700 community housing properties back in 2009. And that number went up to 19,200 properties in 2019. So we had, a fair increase in the number of properties over a decade for community housing. And if I didn't say it before, that number in public housing stays a constant. The graph is just a straight line in terms of the number of properties. And so one sort of starts wondering, well, who is getting into this community housing? Because hang on, there's always people on the waiting list and it's getting longer. Well, what they're doing is they're choosing to make offers to tenants from the back of the list or the middle of the list, in terms of income. And that helps their profitability. I mean, the range of the housing register goes from public housing, you can be $31,000 a year income, up to $54,000 if you're in a couple. But in terms of community housing, this goes all the way up to $86,000 a year, or if you've got two kids, $116,000 a year. So if I'm running a public housing business, I'd rather have 30% of a bigger income. That makes sense. And look, admittedly, I'm also running a business. I've got different costs, and there are some public housing organisations which have got incredibly good hearts. So don't let me just say, I'm just tarring everyone with the same brush. But the fact is that this is where the damage is happening to the people waiting for public housing, is that the money's going elsewhere. Now, it's also interesting that a fair amount of the community housing hasn't been built by them or bought by them. It's been transferred to them by the government. So the government actually also been deliberately transferring properties, in some cases retaining ownership and getting the community housing organisation to just manage the property, or in some cases just the whole lot goes over. There's some pretty strange things going on in politics, but I guess it's all driven by some pretty strange discussions they don't do in public, but in the corridors of power, which sadly volunteer activists from public housing don't get to see. Now, there's another term that gets thrown around, the last term, affordable housing. It's often social and affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is most probably community housing, yet again, just in another disguise. The formal definition is housing rented at 80% of market rate. And there are a number of schemes that have come along over the years that have targeted that market. And having a look at it, most of the organisations involved in this have been community housing businesses taking advantage of it. One of the schemes was the Rudd era global financial crisis. They came up with a scheme called National Rental Affordability Scheme for affordable housing. So if developers would build a house in conjunction with someone else and rent it at 80% of market rate, the government under this scheme, under the Kevin Rudd scheme, would give the developer $11,000 per dwelling per year for 10 years. So that's $110,000 kickback for the rent therefore going, basically. It only came out recently, the Grattan Institute actually did a report on this, and it turned out the average loss that the developers were making was about $4,000. They were getting $11,000 compensation just in case, but the actual average was only $4,000. So they're all getting a windfall of $7,000 per property. And I can guarantee you they all knew that. These are developers. And this is the sort of stuff that all, this is what public housing dollars are chasing, is stuff like this going on. Now, Tony Abbott caught a sniff of this when he came into power. So the scheme was ended in 2014, but we're still seeing the remnants of 10 years of some of these properties still coming through until 2024. Grattan said we lost about $4 billion as a country on this scheme. Windfall to developers. The total number of properties built was estimated about 38,000, of which about 19,000 were developed by community housing businesses. So, half of it was just straight developers, but there you were, community housing was in there as well. So, have you gotten over social and affordable housing yet? It's not public housing, but the public think it is. So, and that's why we've got a housing crisis. There's no public housing being done. And look, people will say, oh, look, Jack, there's room for both. There are people further back in the list who can afford it. Yeah, well, but I don't think there's room for both when there's public money going through this. I'm happy for these organisations to survive on their own skills, business skills, but until we get rid of that public housing queue and also provide public housing to everyone who deserves it, I don't think we should be giving 1 cent of government money to anyone else. It's a thing they call neoliberalism if you study politics. It's where a government basically outsources policy to private companies and lobbyists who produce the best business case. And, and this is, I guess this is my little speech against privatisation. And we've seen the damage of that just in terms of utilities recently, and roads and Transurban and, and all these people building tunnels everywhere, which we'll then pay tolls for the next 40 years. They're all great at making money, these people, because I've got to tell you, if it's been privatised, someone's making money. I will make another mention on affordable housing, because some people who are trying to buy a house are also saying housing is not affordable. Now, we're really talking about rental housing, we're talking public housing. But in terms of people struggling to buy something, I mean, a lot of the high prices in housing is because it's seen as an investment. It's a way of making money, and it's negative gearing and discounted capital gains tax that make that sort of thing happen. However, we have seen some stuff come out recently from the government in terms of schemes for people to be able to buy a house, such as the government will actually buy or pay for 40% of the price of a house for eligible applicants. And they will also subsidise the discount so that the people only pay 5% of the purchase price of the property. The catch is when the house gets sold or property gets sold, it has to be paid back at the market rate. So if it's made a profit, the government also gets its share. And it's sort of estimated if property was going up like it has been, people will probably never be able to even buy that. They would have to sell it and just, salvage whatever. And the other very strong opinion is that it just increases the market demand and drives prices even further. But I don't want to get into a political debate because that's what our two major parties more or less were looking at, ways of helping people buy new houses, which is not the discussion today. I'll also mention crisis and emergency accommodation. That's not public housing. That's temporary stuff for crisis and emergency. Um, it's a lot of that. There's almost zero government presence in there. It's churches, charities. That's sort of the base where a lot of these have come from. And I've got to say, it's pretty rough. I mean, there's a friend of mine called Sandy I met a few years ago, homeless lady, and she got an overnight accommodation in a well-known crisis accommodation provider. I mean, these guys have fancy glossy brochures. They get a lot of government subsidies as well. And she said, Jack, I moved out. I'd rather be on the street than in there, because in there you get robbed. If you're a female, you're a danger. Pretty rough stuff going on there. Massively mismanaged, and a lot of subsidies being gathered from the government. So and don't let me talk about during COVID, because I hear they were actually double stacking some rooms to make even more money. But that's really just a rumour, and I don't have any facts behind it. So that's crisis and emergency accommodation. Now, in terms of homeless, there is the way that has now been pioneered in a number of countries overseas. Finland was one of the first to adopt this. It's called Housing First. Housing First. And what they do there is dignity. For a homeless person, you're given housing with a kitchen, an ensuite, a lockable door that you only live in. It's not double shared. And you are wrapped with services and support to get you back on your feet and back into society. This thing has been brilliant. I mean, in just a number of years, Finland reduced their homeless by about 50%. And it's a lovely coloured graph. They got all the different categories of homeless, and you just see this graph coming down, and then there's a certain core that you will never reduce, which you're sort of getting down close to. Some of the crisis accommodation providers in Victoria have recently been announcing projects. Now, these crisis people are usually also, by the way, branched into community housing since their start 20 years ago. So, I'm adding them into that category, but they've been getting into this housing first area, or I'll call it market. And I suspect they're after the money that can be made from providing services. Now, there is a lot of charitable and good-hearted support behind this. I've seen a couple of press announcements. The City of Melbourne has donated buildings to providers. Philanthropists have given money. The government has given subsidies. The idea is right. Everyone does get their own bedroom and all those sort of things, and they do talk about services. So I really wish those organisations well. I'd be much more comfortable if it was the government running it with a welfare objective. Some of them sound very good. They're even on the news. Accommodation for women escaping violence down in Dandenong, 60 ladies, 160 kids in a place there in Dandenong Central. So a lot of stuff coming out of that crisis and accommodation space. But I'm wary, because it's the community housing providers who are providing the stuff. And oh, by the way, and we do know there's a bucket load of government money going in there, because this is the ex-homeless people that were housed in hotel rooms. Remember that during COVID? So halfway through that, or when it looked like coming to an end, the Andrews government did announce a bucket load of money to be given to a couple of the crisis accommodation providers to do what we're now seeing the announcements around. That's probably me for definitions. So public housing, if you don't say it, it's not public housing. And in practice, anyone saying social or affordable housing is absolutely lobbying for more community housing, or actually talking about community housing, or is just an innocent bystander who has read something and doesn't know better. I mean, I had friends come ring me and say, Jack, you would be wrapped in this big housing bill that the government announced a couple of years ago. All that public housing they're building. And I said, no, they're building social housing. And I'm not wrapped, I'm actually shattered. Time's looking good. So let's talk about what's been going on. So the government's been, in terms of policy, we've seen a lot of the housing estates being, the land being sold off or give away to private developers under the disguise of what they call a real estate model for building more public housing. So example is there's a place in Walker Street in Northcote, 89 units. The founder of Public Housing, Friends of Public Housing Victoria, lives there and lived there for 30 years. And along comes this public housing renewal program idea. And in exchange for building 10% extra public housing dwellings, the developer is allowed to build a number of other dwellings for private sale. Not only that, we were shocked when the details started to come out there on this program. There were 22 estates around Melbourne they looked at. These are not towers. These are places, in many cases, 2-3 stories high. You probably don't even notice them when you drive past them. Communities of public housing, people living there for long times, new people coming in and out. And all of a sudden they had the rug pulled out from under them for the sake of developer profits. And this stuff doesn't happen by accident. This is what got me mad. Someone is, either the government is corrupt or people are just lobbying really well. I think it's people are just lobbying really well. It just becomes easy path out. I don't want to accuse people of corruption, but in the end, it gets bad for us. So here we go. I'll show you when the first free public housing public housing renewal program estates got given contracts. This is what we saw. Okay, so this is called the first tranche of the public housing renewal program. So in Northcote, 87 units. I actually went over there 10%. They actually planned to develop 106 units. And into that same space, they were going to cram in an extra 143 apartments. And, you know, it's a similar story everywhere else. Preston is a broad term. There are actually sort of 3 or 4 mini locations in there that all added up. So basically the bottom line is for 225 units, they were going to wreck them, throw out the tenants, and we'd get back 329 social housing units. Oh no, yeah, it's no longer public housing. They're going to give it to community housing to manage. And also the total there, 732 private apartments. So this is not even public, this is not any housing, this is the profit housing. So a total of 225 units on estates, and they rebuild it with 1,061 units. And this was a shocker. And not only that, but the units that the tenants are coming back to are community housing, which we talked about as different terms, different conditions. So they're not getting back exactly what's coming to. And by the way, this was where I actually initially smelled a rat when I got involved in this whole area of public housing activism, because tenants in these estates were being asked to sign all sorts of agreements. And I could smell they were putting high pressure on them. And what got me was that people from, it was the Department of Health and Human Services in those days, they were knocking on doors at 8 p.m. at night to get people to sign agreements. And when people say, could you leave the agreement so I'll get someone to look at it, they refused to. And so we got to see those agreements because someone managed to get a photo of one. Now, for this is not like normal behaviour. So poor field representatives of Department of, whatever from the government, they're not corrupt, but someone was putting massive pressure on them. Let's get this stuff all going. And so it's a boss on a boss on a boss. Somewhere up the chain, someone knew what was going on and there was pressure going on. and it's been a heck of a lot of a battle since. And only just the other day, we finally got to hear a bit more about Walker Street. This is the one I mentioned here, Northcote. Oh, by the way, just another thing. I haven't got the numbers for the other estates, but when they redeveloped the 87 units in Northcote into 106 social housing units, we lost 30% of the bedroom numbers because there were 3 and 2 bedroom apartments were being developed into 2 and 1 bedroom apartments. For giving away all that public land, we actually lost bedrooms. This is a fact. This is the Melbourne Age they talked about. So let me just show you what happens in Walker Street. So if you can see my cursor along the right-hand side of the photo, that's High Street, Northcote. At the bottom of the photo is Merry Creek. When they initially built public housing, there was probably rats and all sorts of stuff running around, not very nice. It's very nice now. You can ride your bike along there. And look at the public housing estate. There's 3 to 4 story stuff there going around the quadrangle. There's playing areas for kids. There's open housing. It's a wonderful community. There's people who live there 30 years. They replaced that with 6 housing towers. If you look at the plan on the right, so all the white bit going up and down and a bit across the top, that's all housing towers. The bit along the right-hand side, which faces High Street, that's where the social housing apartments will be. Surprise, surprise. We still don't know, and this has happened on other estates. They've actually built a fence to distinguish the 2 areas. The other side, this is, you should see the stuff. It's on, you go on realestate.com, you can have a look at it. You know, it's glass and marble everywhere. And guess what? Priced from $465,000 a unit. That'll be a 1-bedroom place on the ground floor, looking out on Walker Street, up to $3 million. This was called a good deal for public housing. I think I've convinced you that the public housing renewal program is a joke, but it's not a joke that we have people in power who knew this and let it happen. And in the meantime, as I've said, they're building no public housing, and there's a pool of people swimming around at the front of that queue, and they're waiting not 1 or 2 years as they might report on the Victorian Public Tenants Association. There are a lot of people waiting 5 years. They're giving up. They're moving elsewhere. It's a tragedy. And I hope you now get why I get angry. Okay. What else is the government doing? I've talked about a lot of land transfers. You see it every now and then. I subscribe to the Victorian government press releases, which mysteriously stopped coming to me out of the blue. They told me it was an IT error once. I had to go right through everywhere to get it working. You know, they've stopped coming to me again. I'm not suggesting anyone's doing anything in the background. It's just weird. Anyway, public press release just before COVID. The lovely people in the city of Port Phillip donated the car park at the Balaclava railway station to a community housing company called Housing First. No gap between the words housing and first. Notice that their marketing department got clever and grabbed that worldwide name called Housing First as the wonderful process for rehousing homeless. Oh, they were called the Port Phillip Housing Association until a few years ago. They changed their name to Housing First. That's what gets me. These guys, it's not just about good stuff. These guys are pretty ruthless in how they're doing stuff. Anyway, getting back to Balaclava car park. Okay, they give the car park to them. The government donates $22 million to them, and they're going to develop a 46 apartment complex to be run by Housing First, a community housing company. Very nice of City of Port Phillip to be looking after the people higher up the food chain. And this stuff just goes on and on and on and on and on. And we're running out of time for me to be able to do that. I get a bit passionate about it. The federal government has a thing called the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. Housing finance, no, go to the website. They finance housing for community housing to build. And they do that by raising bonds and getting institutional investors and overseas investors to invest money in these bonds. In other words, our government is underwriting the loan to the community housing business. You would wonder why, if community housing businesses are struggling like many of them claim, you'd wonder why these investors are putting their money in. And well, the CEO of the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, he told it nicely. Nathan Dalbon was his name, and he said, "We are really thrilled that community housing is emerging as a new investment asset class." Doesn't sound like public welfare to me. That's why I get mad. So let's get back to the big housing build, which I've referred to a number of times. It was announced in the 2020 budget, $5 billion, 12,000 social housing homes. And Homes Victoria, it's all on the website, but people just don't look, because why would you? I guess if you're someone like me, you do. So I'll show you what they're doing. Hopefully everyone can see that. So there's 4 little sections of the big housing build. First one, $500 odd million in the middle, 500 new social housing properties, 540 new affordable and market homes. Existing properties, next panel, 900 odd million. And there they're looking at working with the private sector to bring forward large developments that they can then buy. Again, social and affordable properties, this time sourced from existing developments. And I guess if there's any builders struggling or wanting to offload something, that'll be good news for them. Not sure how they're going. And then here comes the serious stuff. Third panel, $1.38 billion. And in the writing above, funding projects by the community housing sector. They actually spell it out there. 4,200 community housing homes. And finally, $2.14 billion, by far the biggest sector, partnerships with private and the community housing sector. So this is private developers, even worse, I would suggest, and the community housing sector. So when my friends rang me to say, aren't you excited? As you can see, not really. They did announce a little offshoot to this, $300 million, maybe 400, depending on who you hear from, which is to maintain the existing public housing properties and complete that shocking program called the Public Housing Renewal Program. By the way, it makes me feel good as an activist to know that the government listens. Because when we found out about the the Public Housing Renewal Program producing what it did, and there was an outcry about it. I went to the website of Homes Victoria and they had changed every page. It was now the Social Housing Renewal Program. They're highly cynical, and they've just gone and, someone went to the trouble, or they already had it set up. We go, let's change it from public to social. But at least, heck, I now know they were listening to us. How else is a big housing build going? Well, there's stuff happening in Flemington. There's stuff happening in North Richmond. If you ever go through North Richmond along Elizabeth Street, a lot of people do that off Albert Street if you're heading east to the eastern suburbs. You see those towers, they're in blue. There's 4 of them there. And the big housing build, they're actually going to tart them up. I think they're calling it refurbish. Not too sure who's going to manage them. Obviously, the tenants will have to move out in the meantime, and then a lot of the open space has been taken up by all that stuff in red, which will be private and community housing developments. So, you know, and that's just another classic big housing build project, just one of the many. And I've got to say, there's been a heck of a lot of public land being given away in this. There seems to be either giving it away or they're doing this sneaky thing called 50-year leases. They did one in Belfield recently with one of the community housing businesses, 50-year lease. So I guess they're getting the land, and there's, you know, there's all sorts of terms and conditions behind this, you know, and how it all returns to a normal use, etc. So won't go into detail, but believe me, there's about 2,000 pockets of public land around Melbourne we've discovered that could be used for public housing. So it's a heck of a lot of stuff there to give us a head start. Okay, so why is this all happening? How has this happened? Let me just say, I think there's a heck of a lot of lobbying, but all industries have their lobbyists. But if I observe it rightly, and this has been said by others, that these guys have basically controlled the debate about public housing, turn it into a debate about social and affordable housing, and basically shut down public housing. There's a lot of report writers, professors, researchers, institutes, foundations, councils. They're all feeding off this lobbying industry. Who's paying them? It's a bit like big tobacco. You always look at who's paying someone, who's paying for the research, who's sponsoring this chair at this university or tertiary institution. You know, have a look at it. And then, so I don't want to name names, but this stuff is going on, and you know, people don't know about it. They run fancy conferences called the Homelessness and Housing Conference. There was one in Canberra recently. I don't think there was a public housing activist there, but nor would they let us there. I mean, they have their right to exist, but don't hijack the damn conference and housing and homelessness and whatever for your private interests. Call it something else. You make me mad. I mean, not many homeless people get to go that. They probably had some sponsored people they flew up. Talk about lobbying though. There's this. How powerful is this social housing lobby? You may remember in the news, it was in February, I'm just looking it up, the 22nd of February, they announced, the Victorian government announced, they'd do this big press conference, 1.75% of all new developments over 3 dwellings, 1.75% will be levied for social housing development. Obviously, not something that just the government came up with. They would have, you know, they would have had the lobbyists in the back rooms or in their expensive restaurants over lunch or however they network and in the back corridors. So this has come up. There was also an adjacent policy announced that they're also going to exempt social housing, community housing from council rates. The Andrews government doesn't backflip on very publicly announced policies very often, but on the 1st of March, they announced that 1.75% levy was being dropped. I think the developer industry, just the straight out housing developers, have got an even stronger lobby group. What else do? They stigmatise public housing. It's been deliberately run down. There is a maintenance budget for it. They don't come when the tenants ring. They could also refurbish these places, build balconies on them, repaint them. But it's deliberately being run down. Victorian Attorney General's office in 2012 and in 2017 wrote a report damning the government for its lack of maintenance program for public housing. But the government knew why. They didn't want to spend money on this. It was going elsewhere to business people. There's just this general stigmatisation. Public housing people are lazy, they're druggies. You know what the best thing that happened during lockdown for public housing? They did the Flemington Tower surround Remember, it was all surrounded by police and they locked down a towers in Flemington. Were they druggies or losers? No, there were mums going over the road to do the shopping for their baby. There were people trying to get to work. There were security guards. There were students. Their crime was they're lowly paid, and that's why they're in public housing, and that's why we should be providing it for them. And I think that actually removed a lot of the stigma. It actually gave a face to the public housing tenants with their normal needs and wants. So that's it. So like, all I wanted to talk about is what can you do?
Yes.
But hopefully I haven't just, I didn't want to educate you. I wanted to get a message across though.
Oh, I think we've got the message.
Yeah. So the message is only public housing is public housing. And I've given you details on why it's not. Hopefully I've proved it, I've shown you. So beat up those politicians. If you're in a political party, beat them up. And I can guarantee you, they're clever, clever, clever little rascals. They will have a really clever answer back about coexistence and all this stuff. Well, if we want to coexist, well, let's start calling Scotch College community schooling. You know, all those expensive private schools, let's call them community. So we feel better about giving money to them, which we do. There's no coexistence. It's either public welfare or it's capitalism. Yeah, I'll end on that.
Thank you. It's a great wake up for most of us.
Thanks.
And I'm sure that people will have many questions, especially on the what can we do and how could we possibly get towards the Finnish model and do things better. I'm sure there are some burning questions for Jack. So Howard, would you like to sort of kick off and help direct that?
Sure. We've got 2 questions from Mel. So Mel, would you like to read those out?
Yeah, primarily is what do we do about the problem, and should we, which I feel we should, also make sure that rental assistance is increased and is available to whether somebody's in public, social, community or whatever housing. So it's increased so people can afford to maybe rent privately if they need to, but also increase and be available to everybody regardless, you know, income based obviously, but yeah. So what do we do about the problem of public housing, and then should we increase, you know, rental assistance?
Yeah, there is rental assistance available outside of what I just talked about, so into the private market as well. I'm not too well an expert on it. I think is that Commonwealth rental assistance, Howard, or is it different? There's also, I mean, they help you with bonds and all that sort of stuff. But look, let me get back to the thing that matters. What do we do about public housing? My observation of the protest groups, other than one, is that a lot of them have been involved in the welfare of existing public housing tenants. There are a lot of injustices going on, and so they're supporting those people. They're getting involved in issues on an housing estate or whatever. But I think what we need is more action at the political level, because it's a political will to change policy that matters, and political will is driven highly by votes. So, you know, these guys, if they can see that they're going to lose votes on an issue, they will change policy. So even against the lobbyist tsunami, because it matters more to these people is electability. I mean, I'll happily talk anywhere, anytime on this topic. And I think it's important to talk to grassroots people in political parties on this topic. So if you now know anyone at that level, and don't let them fob you off with, or, you know, with they know what it's doing and it's coexists. That's what I hear all the time. Like, just ask the question, what about the people at the front of the queue? Because just no one's giving them any oxygen at all. It's just wait until someone leaves or dies and stuff, you know. And it's a pretty big number, and it's getting worse. You know, there's a lot of people applying. But anyway, so yeah, so political party speaking. There's a demo on every Thursday on the steps of Parliament House by Defend and Extend Public Housing, which I know Howard's been associated with. I go along there and hold a poll every now and then.
What time is that, Jack? Demo every
Noon
Thursday,
until 1, usually.
Noon till 1, lunchtimes.
Noon to 1, and then a bit of a feed in a food court around the corner. So
Right.
let's have a chat.
Okay.
These are all just normal people. There's public housing people, but you can. It's good to go there because you hear the stories. Hear the stories of where people are at.
So who are the particular ministers who have jurisdiction here? Probably one of the things that occurs to me is perhaps it crosses numerous portfolios, and that doesn't help either.
Well, it's Richard Wynne.
Well, he's going.
Minister of Planning, and he's going. The new guy who was interviewed for this about this Walker Street estate in the Age was terrible. He just saw everything as being glowing, and I'd be happy to get all these new extra number of social housing dwellings, and didn't seem to be really aware of all the grassroots issues. So yeah, I think they need to get hammered. I can't remember his name, but it just was a shocker of a sort of a train wreck interview that I could read there. Although I guess the average reader wouldn't have known that. Martin Foley is going as well. So he was involved in this area. So yeah, I think we'll need to find out who it is. Right to Friends of Public Housing, we're going to run a campaign. We've had run it before where we actually write to all the people standing for Parliament. But, you know, and by the way, Labor and Liberal are both the same on this policy. They're in cahoots. So it really gets down to them seeing a policy opportunity. And I guess Andrews is not going to do a backflip on his big housing build at the moment. Liberals might. He might look at more public housing though. They did it last election. They promised an extra 1,000. We actually went at them really hard. They came out, it was really coincidental, beyond coincidence. They came out with an announcement for more public housing. But from what I could gather, little of that actually happened. And the bits that did happen in regional areas are not in metro. There's some crazy stuff going on there, you know, little houses and philanthropists getting involved as well, which, you know, really is not what I think, you know, we should be looking at in terms of, you know, proper housing for people. Yeah, but the grassroots people of both Labor and Liberal are shocked when they find this out. So book me speaking slots.
Okay, who's next, Howard?
We've got 3 other questions. We've got 2 from Kevin Bain, and 1 from Vince. So Kevin, would you like to read out your 2?
Right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Look, I'll actually just cut to the chase here, and I want to ask Jack, who are your allies? What do they do? What influence do they have? What is the response of the peak bodies such as VCOS? And what are they doing to highlight this issue? And going back to the, say, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the people who were quite, in my memory, loud in supporting public housing, who became influential in the Labor Party, such as Brian Howe and Renata Howe, people like that. So Howard's sort of saying no, I think. So I'd be interested in his opinion as well. But traditionally, there were quite strong public housing advocates within the Labor Party. Are there any there? But more importantly, the people from the field, VCOS, etc. I want to know, what are they doing? What's their view about the issues that you're raising and your solutions?
There was a brave MP from the Labor Party last year before, actually stopped in Parliament and did a speech about this public housing issue. Labor for Public Housing is a group formed internally within the Labor Party, Labor for Public Housing. And I think all the people with the good intentions went there. But I guess if I was someone at the top of the Labor Party with my committed policy, I may not have wanted that group to succeed. Because I know it fizzed, and I don't want to comment on my reasons why I think it fizzed, but it was, other than that, I think it was fairly underhand. That was a Labor Party.
Well, what's the story? I mean, why won't you tell us? Why did it
It's
fizz?
a public forum. Anyway,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
I'll tell you one-on-one if you want to ring me, but
I can actually add a little bit to that.
yeah.
I used to be very involved as well in a couple of groups, including the one that Jack's involved in. I've kind of moved away from that the last couple of years. But I do recall Labor for Housing being set up, and as Jack said, there was a lot of intentions joining, but then you had a few high-profile people running the group and conducting the debate. And I actually went to a couple of their meetings and made my point about the policy, but it really seemed to have no impact. It didn't seem to be a lot of genuine interest in public housing. It was more a general concern amongst the Labor Party for housing rather than public housing itself. And then when the big housing bill was announced, I noticed comments on their Facebook page was, "Oh, hallelujah, this is what we've been waiting for." You know, so then they thought everything was pretty much solved. So I don't really know that there was that much interest within the Labor Party, amongst the Labor Party activists for public housing per se. They don't seem to really care about the distinction between social housing and public housing.
Well, look, I found these lobbyists for this social housing everywhere, inside every organisation, for whatever reason they're motivated, you know, but they seem to become the power base of that group. And yeah, look, it fizzed out. But it was bravely set up. Now, in terms of our allies, there are a number of organisations that subscribe to the notion that the word social housing is poison, and we all work together. There have been a couple we've actually run into where they wouldn't. They kept saying, no, social housing is the umbrella term for, which was like, yeah, and you should talk how the market talks. Yeah, oh, that's how the lobbyists talk, you know, and this is activist organisations. So I guess, you know, the trouble is we're not professionals, we're volunteers, we don't have budgets and all that stuff. So it's pretty hard yakka, but you know, human misery can't be ignored. I won't ignore it. The costs, Howard?
Yeah, well, VCOS pretty much adopts the umbrella social housing policy, from what I can recall.
A lot of these groups get subsidised by the government, and you know, there is big money in this. There are big bickies in this, and you know, so it gets pretty. You know, people don't play nice buddies at the top, and so a lot of the very prominent groups that get invited onto the drum or whatever, I've been shocked. You know, they're on there for talking about public housing, and they can't handle that word. They only use social housing anyway. Yeah, it's tough. But
you mentioned Brian Howe before. Brian Howe has been identified as the person within the Labor Party who really kick-started the whole process of privatisation. He may well have been supportive of public housing in the 70s, but once he became a minister right towards the end of the Hawke government, and then he was housing minister, I think, for the entire time of the Keating government, and he's generally acknowledged as the one who started privatisation. And of course, Kennett got into power around that time within Victoria. So the federal government has the sets policy and provides funding for the states. The states actually carry out policy.
Yeah, well, I guess so. If you got Keating, who's hell bent on market freedoms, you want to stay as a minister, you'll implement the policy. Sadly, that's the case. It's just we're in a great democracy, and that's how governments and parties operate.
But it's also, there's a lot of lobby groups who are funding politicians and governmental parties to fund social and community housing. They are directly funding efforts against public housing because it's something in it for them.
Yeah.
I looked into a little bit of some of the lobbyist funding going into this, and you'd be shocked. I mean, they're doing it for a reason, and the reason is they're all getting paid to sing at a certain tune. So, yeah.
Well, this is actually a great opportunity for investigative journalism, because it's calling for a commission on it, because heck, have a look at all the people who resisted the Banking Royal Commission, and look at what we found out. Look at the people who resisted the Aged Care Commission, and look at what we found out. There's a lot of parallels with this and the aged care, by the way. A heck of a lot of privatisation there. I know these guys in Walker Street, the developers, MAB Corporation, two brothers own it. Their net worth is $768 million. Now they're going to be selling $3 million apartments. So I guess their net worth is going to go up even more. So, you've got to get this stuff out there.
Yes.
Just to return the questions, Kevin, did you want to ask that first question again? Are you happy that's been addressed? So about the new daily online article.
We'll just leave that. I mean, it just came out today, and I think people should read it. It's obviously in your social housing definition, and it's all about Evan Thornley, who's a very successful businessman in America, Australian businessman, developed the Sikh organisation and became a member of the Victorian Parliament under Steve Bracks, I think. But this is all about trying to harness the capital gains that are available to residential owners across the board in Australia, and actually bring that capital gains benefit forward in terms of providing subsidised rent and low deposits, on the basis that later on, when the capital gains realises, as we all know that it almost certainly does in residential property in Australia, as a way of getting people into houses, private houses. So it's largely to do with social, but it's also as I read it, and I've only just read that article today, I recommend people have a look at it. It's also about not segregated housing, not congregate care, but areas of urban development where people who would be traditional public housing tenants would be situated close to one another, and therefore their social networks may still be able to be continued, rather than have so that there's something that really needs to be looked at there. Because I'll just finish by saying I work on the basis that I've always liked the comment by John Kenneth Galbraith, the American economist, that says markets are a good servant, but a bad master. So we need to see, given that we live in not Disneyland, but in Australia, and within capitalism, what can be leveraged to get the best possible outcome to give a satisfactory and comfortable life to people who are not able to have the assets. And in fact, that whole program that's been talked about by Keating and Evan Thornley at present is all about aimed at single parents and their descendants, their children, and also migrants, because they don't have the bank of mum and dad that most, not most, but many well-off middle class and even working class Australians, as we know, have been able to draw on to buy a house for their kids. So it's all about aimed at that. So it shouldn't be dismissed. It needs, these things need to be flexible enough to be able to try and get what we can out of a system where it's stacked against us at present.
The home ownership thing is way less threatening. It's not taking the public or the rental housing market bucket of money, and it's just looking at other ways. I mean, of getting money into that market. I mean, because I mentioned the 40% purchase what I got, underwritten by in Victoria by the Labor government. If you buy a house, they'll buy 40% of it for you, and will stump up the risk. You only pay 5% deposit. A lot of people have been taking advantage of that. You could never have dreamt of getting into a house. I mean, the long term, who knows where that goes, but it's getting people into houses where they couldn't, as you mentioned, all those various demographics. And by the way, you're right on that social mixing and areas, because people tried mixing housing types and it didn't work. Sounded good on paper, didn't work, and people like their own community of like-minded people. So that did come out. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your comments,
That's why I moved to
fellas.
inner city.
Vince, did you want to read your question out?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. It's been an eye-opener. Look, I've just got more of a straightforward question about the article that you referred to in your presentation, on your presentation slides. The one written by the two academics at RMIT and released back in May 2019. I haven't read it, but I just looked at it online, and it looks fairly comprehensive. They seem to have done quite a lot of research, and they're basically saying in the summary that the government needs to reconsider the public renewal program that you mentioned, and that they should be investing directly into public housing. I'm just wondering if you can tell us what's happened to that report, what reception it got in government, and what if any follow-up, because I think publicly available, well-researched reports like this can have a big effect on government if they're lobbied in the right direction.
Yeah, they pinched one of my tables actually when I did that report, but never mind.
Did they cite you?
Yeah, no, it's all right. I mean, it was the numbers around, but I actually arranged them in a certain way to give a message. I've got a background in marketing, and I tweaked stuff.
Yep.
And I noticed it reappeared that way in the report, which is good. It's nice, you know. But yeah, look, the public housing renewal program is pretty well steamed along. It's expanded its scope into a lot more other estates or venues. And they've been tweaking all sorts of models. We don't get to see the fine detail of the, it's commercial in confidence, the agreement between the developer and the community housing organisation, and what the government's getting out of it, not getting out of it, profitability, etc. And and it's a risky market. They'll be building in fat as well. So people just don't want to show that sort of stuff. I just know there's been tweaks going on, in some cases a resale arrangement, or the land gets leased for 40 years rather than given away, and reverts back to government ownership then. So all sorts of variation of the same, not necessarily on those estates, but on similar developments. But no sort of slowing down of steam or the model of financing a trivial increase in public housing for a fairly good windfall for the developers. Yeah, and it's just madness because we're losing incredibly precious public land that we could be building public housing on. The those towers in Flemington, there's 4 towers there. And they're actually not even building social housing there. It's actually within the playgrounds the kids are using. They're building 800 odd apartments across, I think it's about 7 towers for housing. It's on the Homes Victoria website, and they got no shame in this. And the sale of that and the private developer and how much the government gets out of it, I don't know. But surely the government's not that broke that it's trying to make whatever millions or billions out of giving away that land versus getting its finance from other sources, like the Bank of Anthony Albanese, I guess. Yeah.
Paul, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi everyone. Jack, I find myself implicated by things you've said, which is a good thing. And I'm thinking critically about 2 things I'm a bit aware of. One is uniting church efforts over probably 15 or 20 years to become what was a housing association, to get government funds to build what I thought was called assisted housing on church lands which are not being used. And I don't know whether that's outside of what you're saying because it's not public housing per se, but you might comment on that. And with that, in recent years, only because we sold a house and had to do something with money, I've put quite a bit of savings into Australian Unity, which could be said to be not one of the bad boys in corporate life because they do medical, but they ended up with a portfolio of developments. I'm not quite sure, it was a bit unexpected, and they've pursued that. So any of us, if we think they're doing a good thing, can loan our money to developers who are building just, commercial places. Now, I spoke to Oz Unity just a week or 2 ago. Out of this context, I'm telling you, I said, are you committed to put any of our money into, and I called it assisted housing? And they told me that the planets were aligning because just recently they've made a deal with one of the Uniting Church properties somewhere to do some housing stuff. So I'm just wanting to get a bit more perspective because I take a critical place in the scheme of things Uniting Church. But the other thing to ask you then is just in the last few minutes, you referred to the deals that are made. So the government made some kind of deal with the Uniting Church, whoever that is. And I don't know whether there would be secret and unpleasant bad things in that or whether I should be asking. So you got my questions okay.
Listen, so it looks like someone called a developer's getting hold of some land out of this, which developers like. They need land. The stuff that's getting built on it sounds like it'll be community housing. It may be run very nicely, and tenants won't get thrown out if they're a week behind in their rent and stuff like that we've heard elsewhere. It may be operate on all those grounds, but they're not taking in people from the front of the public housing waiting list. Right. But if this is just stuff between developers and a church, it's an investment proposition, I guess, as a church is happy to lose its land.
I don't imagine that the church would part with the land because it's held in trust, like all the denominational properties are held in trust, but they can make it available and they can do a 99-year lease or something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that goes
anyway,
on a lot.
The developers won't get anything out of the land per se. It's just the opportunity for them to presumably get something commercial out of the building. But is it not a good thing if they are providing housing in this way, even though it's commercial? You're not totally against that aspect of it, are you?
Well, I think everyone who gets a dwelling out of this once it gets done, they'll be very grateful for it. So it's a very good thing for them, but I guess it's not the priority for me. That's all.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Because there is this massive need elsewhere, and that's why that needs keeps happening, because we're seeing offers for dwellings made to people further back in the list. That's all.
But also too, I mean, while Uniting Church perhaps doesn't have this problem, Salvation Army do provide similar to what Uniting Church does. Problem is, with them, if you happen to be LGBTQIA+, then you are SOL, shit out of luck. I ain't going to help you, not even with crisis accommodation. So this is the problem. And while United Church, they seem to be pro-gay and whatnot, pro-trans. Places like the Salvation Army who do similar definitely are anti-gay. And so I feel like if places like religious organisation is going to get money to provide housing or crisis accommodation or what have you, then there should be the stipulation you have to provide it to everybody, not just to who you think it should apply to. And that's where I have a big problem with it, is that, look, I mean, if they're going to do the right thing, like the Uniting Church, and provide it to anybody, regardless of their sexuality or gender, and there is some sort of, you're not going to charge too much rent and all that sort of stuff, got to do the right thing by looking after the properties and whatnot, great. But the problem is there's absolutely no guarantee of that. So that you got to remind it that, like, while maybe Uniting Church may be one of the few religious organisations doing the right thing, a lot of them aren't, and that's where it becomes like they're allowed to discriminate under our laws, by the way, too. They get away with it. So that's an issue that we got to remember, I think.
So no other questions? I've put in the chat, last entry in chat, I've put in details of, firstly, the rally. Also, Jack is on, or someone else from either Friends of Public Housing or Defend and Extend Public Housing is on radio once a month. And also I put the details of Debbie's group as well last night.
Yeah, I get a run with my friend Catherine Murdoch on City Limits, third Wednesday, 9 till 10 on 3CR.
Okay. All right.
I should say I'm not a member of the Greens, but there might be other members of the Greens who are holding back. But they do have a policy which they developed in association with Friends of Public Housing Victoria and Defend and Extend Public Housing Australia of not privatising public housing and also building enough public housing for all those on the waiting list. I think it's over a 6 or 10 year period or something.
So the Greens are very aware of this issue.
I wonder, Jack, whether you might be able to put down a few dot points at a later date and some ideas about who could, for writing letters, and who they would be best directed to, so that we can circulate that and give some thought ourselves to expanding this issue. We've got an election coming up. I mean, every little bit is worth attempting.
And the city of Richmond or Yarra has 20% public and community housing residents. And so there's a very strong campaign, I'm aware, that the Greens are running to that.
There. Okay. All right. Well, we need to keep the issue afloat, I think, at least until the election. because it's an opportunity to amplify the message and see if we can have some impact on it. So if you would be able to write down some of the ideas that are in your head about where to from here, simple, mechanisms that people might be able to take the issue forward, that would be a great help. Okay.
Yeah, well, I've got a document here which about 4 pages.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that's a mirror image, I take it.
Yes. Okay.
But anyway, that's worth. I've sort of got a lot of the basic information in it, so
All
if
right.
people want to lean on it, I'll have a look at maybe put some more facts in there rather than writing.
Mm.
It helps. Yeah.
Okay. Is anyone else sitting on a question that they want to take the opportunity? Kieran, please. You're unmute, please.
There we go. Sorry about that. Very brief comment. I'm aware from personal experience of many poor and homeless people moving to regional areas.
Yes.
And I'm also aware of those people living in what councils would call substandard accommodation. Mm. And I'm also aware that those councils employ a compliance officer who goes around knocking on doors in the dead of night to find these people and turf them out. And I think that's a very worrying development.
Mm. The regions have really suffered because of the drift of metropolitan people to the regions buying houses. So a lot of rental properties have been sold by the owners to get a windfall, which means the people who are renting have nowhere to go. They literally find out the house is being sold. A month later, they're on the street. They can't find anywhere else to rent. And so they end up in Maui and they're camping on the Murray River. Yep. I'm not joking. They're camping on the Murray River. And where's that in the news?
Yes.
They did talk about Mornington Peninsula and people camping there and cars. That got done. But if you go down to Forest Hills Chase tonight, you'll find cars there. People are sleeping in those cars because there's outdoor toilets they can use to do their washing and teeth in the morning.
Indeed.
And the inaction of the people who should know better, just really, I just don't understand it.
But yeah, I think that's everywhere. Like, I mean, my parents live on Morning Peninsula and they've got a friend, Sandy, who lives in someone's garage because she was living on the beach prior to that.
Yeah.
And but the western suburbs, I mean, we have upwards of, I mean, there are places here that have upwards of 10 people in a house. Like, they often have multiple generations of multiple people, just because I mean, the level of poverty in the western suburbs is, frankly, it's unbelievable. I mean, like, a lot of organisations provide breakfast clubs to kids at schools here because that'll be the only meal those kids get all day, period. I mean, ever, you know.
His poverty is even a bigger issue.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, you're here, like, it's just a number of people per house with a lot of problems. So, I mean, this is the thing. It's like we've got to get both the state and federal governments to do something. We
really got to be careful about the privatisation, is because outsource it rather than do it yourself as a government. It costs more. People are making a profit out of it every bit along the way. You know, keep it in house. So I'm an anti-privatisation person.
John,
that's why they're in there. That's why who pays these lobbyists and the websites and all that, you know.
John?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I've been watching the price of houses skyrocket since about Keating's time, I suppose. I'm just a general question about whether you feel that the decreasing amount of public housing is connected to the ever-rising cost of housing. Thanks. Thanks for your talk.
Yeah,
really enlightening.
If decent quality public housing was available, like it is in many other countries. So in Europe, it's 30% in some countries. You know, this is the way things work. And over here, the housing market is very, very unusual because of a few of these policies. Now negative gearing, all that didn't come in back when prices started going up. I guess I took an interest in it when I got old enough. They've basically gone up and up and up all along. Every now and then a hiccup. It's like shares, isn't it? Everything goes up and up.
Well, it makes sense. If you have more public housing, it takes people out of the competitive market as tenants. So, and it restricts the rent down to a particular number that is a certain percentage of their income.
It'll drive down the attractiveness of buying an investment to rent out. And
so it would tend to reduce the pressure on rents. And also, if the rents are lower, that means it's less, as Jack's saying, less return for an investor, which means they'd be putting less money into it. I think indirectly it would be contributing, lower level of public housing would be contributing to the higher house prices and higher rents. And I think that's part of the motivation of doing it. It's undeclared, but I think government policy is geared towards investor returns rather than needs of people generally. And that's a broad, broad general ideology which we need to address, quite apart from the individual particular question. And just one other thing, we've referred to the media a bit. So I invite people to look at the media, whether it's the ABC, the Age, any other serious media outlet, and see if you see any discussion of what Jack's talked about tonight. Because we've tried on a number of occasions to get information into those outlets. And on the rare occasion where we have, the distinction, if it appears at all, between social and public housing has been buried in the article, whereas it should be a prominent feature of the article. So I just invite you to be alert and look at the media and see how it, if you share that judgment.
Okay. We might wrap it up there if there's no one else wanting to make a comment. And I'd like to thank everyone for a very interesting discussion that's followed from Jack's talk. And Jack, you've shone a lot of light on this complex issue, and you've given us a few ideas about how we can engage with this a little more, and we can only be more effective by understanding it better. So many thanks. Housing insecurity, it seems to me, has such a compounding effect, on the lives of kids. It's hard to get a good schooling if you're stuck in this situation, and it's a slippery slope in terms of other social difficulties. So it's the kind of, it's an iceberg situation, really, and because people who are disadvantaged and marginalised are at the centre of it, it's not given a high priority, and there's not much traction about it. So I think that we're all in a better position for your talk tonight. So many thanks. If we were meeting in person, at this point I would give you a small gift from Humanists Victoria, but you will find it in your inbox in the next day or so. So thanks very much indeed. And thank you to everyone who's been part of it. So on that note, I'll say good night.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Okay.